Welcome to Engage Students to Embrace Civility, Part 2. We're going to have a lot more fun with this part because we're going to be talking about the marvelous research-based strategies to engage students to embrace civility. In this part, we'll be addressing the positive strategies to achieve effectiveness. We need to start by first focusing on positive strategies for overall school climate that will support resilience of all students. So these are the preliminary issues, the foundational issues to positive improvement. It's essential to engage in continuous improvement, ensure that actions are data-driven and evaluated by the data, use evidence-based practices, incorporate multiple-tier system of supports. It's also important these days to shift from an authoritarian approach to one that is more engaged. It's essential to ground our activities in trauma-informed care, focusing on increasing resilience. And I also think it's very important to integrate a new theory. It's called self-determination theory. We will talk about all of these. This graphic is from a very helpful Department of Education document and describes a continuous improvement cycle, identifying local needs, using evidence-based best practices, planning for implementation, implementing, and then the most important step of examining and refining and reflecting on what you're doing. The information on this slide is exceptionally important. Actions of schools have to be data-driven, and this means more than just office disciplinary reports. Schools need to be conducting annual surveys of school climate, as well as focus groups, especially with those students who have greater challenges, in addition to looking at school reports. It is essential that the data be evaluated effectively, doing a study of the correlations. What percentage of students do not feel that there's a staff member who has a close relationship with them? And then look at that based on minority groups or the percentage of students who don't feel safe coming to school. It is also imperative to evaluate the data longitudinally. Has 1 in 4 of your students not thought that there's any staff member who cares about them for the last 5 or 10 years? This evaluation is essential. Then the data needs to be used. The data is for the purpose of identifying needs, developing objectives and strategies to meet those needs, and most importantly, to evaluate the effectiveness of those efforts. Under ESSA, there are 4 categories for evidence-based programs: ones that have strong evidence from a well-designed experimental study, moderate evidence from a quasi-experimental study, promising evidence from a correlation study, and a solid rationale grounded in research with a strong focus on evaluation. You should understand that the insight presented in this presentation is based on the research rationale. Educators, I'm sure, are well familiar with the multiple tier system of supports. This approach is going to be adapted for use in addressing bullying and other hurtful situations. We'll be addressing that later. It's essential to shift from what is an authoritarian paradigm, thinking that adults have control, to an engagement paradigm. Research has actually shown that schools that function in an authoritarian manner actually have higher levels of violence and bullying. A trauma-informed care is absolutely imperative. If a student has experienced trauma, problem behavior is a result of critical deficits or triggering in response to a stressful situation, not a lack of motivation. We have to shift from the perspective of thinking, what is wrong with this child, to an inquiry into what wrong has happened to this child. The evidence on supporting resilience in children and what supports positive outcomes for those who have experienced trauma or toxic stress is really clear. This from the Center for the Developing Child from Harvard University. What supports positive outcomes are supportive adult-child relationships, a sense of self-efficacy and perceived control, opportunities to strengthen adaptive skills and self-regulatory capacities, and mobilizing sources of faith, hope, and cultural traditions. This whole program is grounded in these four positive components. Many schools have implemented positive behavior intervention and supports, and many components of the PBIS framework are excellent. The biggest problem is that many of the principles within PBIS are grounded in research of B.F. Skinner, which is from 1953. We've gained significantly greater understanding of motivations of human behavior, especially related to trauma. Okay, this is the essence of the problem with the current thinking of PBIS, and that is it's grounded in B.F. Skinner. This is from a very recent article on the PBIS app site. A student's reasons for acting out are rooted in one of two motivations: getting something or avoiding something. This thinking is totally out of accord with our increased understandings of the impact of trauma on students' behavior, as well as the challenges associated with ADHD and ASD. It's this hidebound thinking that is not allowing PBIS to shift and fully integrate trauma-informed care. That is the essence of PBIS that has to change. The excellent framework from PBIS holds that intervention should be supported by research, fully integrates multiple tier system of supports, sets forth a standardized problem-solving approach for assessment and instructional decision-making, also ensures explicit database decision rules for assessing student progress and making instructional and intervention assessments, and there's a strong focus on assessment and evaluation throughout the program. It is necessary to update the thinking of PBIS to fully integrate trauma-informed care, increase student voice, shift to positive acknowledgement and gratitude, provide social-emotional learning instruction, address cultural competence, and rely on restorative practices and collaborative problem-solving to address misbehavior. It's also important to expand the forms of data collection for evaluation. When I discovered the self-determination theory, I thought I had just finally come home because I found a theory that supported everything that I had been thinking. In accord with the self-determination, there are three essential needs of all human beings. We have a need for relationships, being cared for and connected with others. We have a need for mastery, a desire to gain competence in things that are important to us. And we also have the need for autonomy, the feeling that we have personal control. So to apply the self-determination theory to efforts to encourage and foster positive behavior, we must maintain an inclusive environment, ensure that all students have skills to foster positive relations, and engage students in a leadership capacity. This slide sets forth all of the elements that I think are essential. Now, I'm not going to read all of these because we're going to go over them one at a time. But as you'll see, I'm framing this within the context of the self-determination theory, that what we're focusing on is increasing positive connections, increasing competencies, and ensuring that we are engaging students in a leadership manner. Under connections, we have to ensure that schools engage in relationship mapping to ensure that every student has one or more staff member allies who are paying attention to their needs. Also establish ongoing community circles for discussions about the quality of the school community. We have to engage students in the creation of a statement of shared values, as well as their personal commitments, ensure that the school is culturally inclusive, and focus on school-wide initiatives supporting kindness and gratitude. Engage students and staff in making positive acknowledgments of positive behavior of their peers, and support accountability for any wrongdoing with an obligation of remedying the harm. This has already been stated in terms of resilience, but there may be nothing more important in a child's life than a positive, stable relationship with a caring adult. In schools, we've got to ensure that every single student has a positive connection with at least one school adult, and this can have tremendous positive impact. The great folks at the Making Caring Common program of the Harvard University Graduate School of Education have a very easy to implement guide to relationship mapping that will allow your school staff to identify students who they perceive to be at higher risk, as well as their relationships with those students. I suggest a slight modification. The Harvard folks use two different colors. I suggest three. Green for a good contact, yellow some contact, and red for identifying those at risk. Then it's important to make sure every single student has at least one staff ally, and the kids who are at higher risk need two or more. It's very important to hold weekly community circles, either in the classrooms at the elementary level or advisories or homerooms at the secondary level. Also, schools can have groups hold community circles in other environments, such as athletics or other extracurricular organizations. Community circles allow students to talk about what's going on in their lives, as well as share values and what's going on within the school environment. Our schools have to be safe and welcoming for all students from all different kinds of groups of students. It's important to engage in an assessment of the degree to which the students in your school feel that they are welcomed and that the school is inclusive. And then once you have done that assessment, take the steps necessary to make improvements and evaluate the effectiveness of your efforts. Engage your student leaders to initiate a whole range of initiatives to encourage random acts of kindness. Kindness is teachable, it's contagious, and will have exceptionally beneficial impacts on how safe and welcome students feel when they come to your school. This is easy to implement. Just get your students in charge and can have great benefits. The research on gratitude is really quite interesting and amazing. It seems that gratitude, expressing feelings of thanks, can actually help rewire your brain to achieve greater happiness. So, expanding the Acts of Kindness initiative under student leadership also encouraged students to focus on acts of gratitude. Yes, there's a role for clear expectations in school, but expand beyond that to collaboratively engage your students in the creation of a statement of shared values. You can create a statement or a word cloud for display in every classroom or in the school. Then have each student create individual statements of personal commitments, how they want to be treated, and their commitments for how they will treat others. You can have the students review these commitments periodically, and having that commitment written and in an envelope in a classroom or advisory, and then taking that commitment when you have to go talk to a principal for when you have not abided by the commitment you made can be exceptionally helpful in an intervention. Shift away from token rewards that discourage, shame, and exclude, and encourage all staff and students to provide written great job and thanks notes. Teach them how to state these as growth mindset. And then make sure that school staff have identified those students who have greater challenges and that they receive an equivalent number of notes. Being accountable should be integrated as part of the shared values of the school. If someone has been hurtful, they should accept personal responsibility and take steps to remedy the harm. Within the context of competencies, it's important that schools implement a comprehensive program to address social emotional competencies and implement school-wide and classroom mindfulness practices. Teaching staff and students how to de-escalate is exceptionally important, and schools should establish a calming place either in the classroom or at the secondary level within the school so that students do have a place to de-escalate. There's always such a focus on students' deficits and deficiencies. Let's have an equivalent focus on students' strengths. Help students embrace problem-solving practices and assist students in learning how to engage in goal setting and action planning, as well as encouraging a growth mindset. I love the statement from a report from the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development from the Aspen Institute. Launched to advance a new vision for what constitutes success for our schools and our students, the Commission began our work by listening to students who shared their thoughts on how they learn best. The young people were clear and unequivocal. They want positive relationships with educators and peers who enhance their sense of belonging in the school and community. They want to know that adults in their schools trust them and care about them, and they want to have the opportunity for meaningful choices and opportunities to make their goals a reality. Now compare this statement to what I set forth with the self-determination theory. We are on the same path with those three basic essential needs. The Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning has done an excellent job of setting forth a framework for the essential social emotional learning skills, as well as an excellent database of effective programs at all grade levels. I highly recommend their site for a resource to establish a comprehensive social emotional learning program. Schools that have implemented mindfulness practices are seeing dramatic improvement in school climate and the relationships between students. There are a significant number of resources available for schools. This is an easy activity to implement and will have profound benefits. This needs to be in every single school. Many of our students are under significant stress, and because they have experienced trauma, toxic situations, they have the potential of triggering into an outburst. Therefore, the skills of de-escalation are exceptionally important for both students and staff. Staff need to avoid tacos, threatening, arguing, challenging, ordering, and shaming students who have simply triggered and lost control. Both staff and students need to understand the skills of de-escalation. This slide focuses on the needs of students. Discuss de-escalation strategies in class. Engage students in problem solving so they can figure out how best they can de-escalate and how they can help their friends de-escalate. Identify students who are more likely to trigger and privately discuss with them what their triggers are and what strategies would help them calm, and have a pre-identified place to go to regain calmness. I highly recommend you go visit the VIA Institute on Character website. You will not be disappointed. These researchers have identified 24 key character strengths that support success and happiness. And their research has indicated that if you intentionally use your strengths each day, this will increase your level of happiness. This is really exciting and fun and enriching focus that can support your social emotional learning program. Within your school, Maintain a focus on building your strengths. The Character Institute has surveys for both teens and adults, as well as learning activities, so you can have students identify their strengths and then celebrate their individual strengths through artwork, and consider their strengths when they're engaged in goal setting and problem solving. Increasing students' abilities to problem solve will help both academically as well as socially. Note that a key component of increasing resilience is the feelings of self-efficacy. Young people need to know how to think things through. Dr. Schur, whose research is cited in the notes, has done a lot of research into how to increase students' ability to problem solve. Also, the collaborative problem solving approach engages students in problem solving. Students need to understand the process. What's the situation? What do I want to accomplish? What strategies, multiple strategies could I use? Is each in accord with my values? And do these strategies use my strengths? For each, what might happen? What's my first best choice? And if that doesn't work, which it might not, what else could I do? This is an exceptionally important component. Problem solving needs to be infused throughout the school climate. We are problem solvers should be a universal theme within the school. All students and staff should have the skills. Ensure that they understand what's going on and establish the goal. Identify possible strategies, consider the possible consequences, weigh the pros and cons, and evaluate the effectiveness. It's important to integrate problem solving into the community circles activities, the accountability process for holding somebody accountable if they've engaged in hurtful behavior, in the development of positive action plans, in the context of discussing growth mindset. There should be a consistent practice of adults asking students how they would solve the problem rather than enunciating an adult solution. Focusing students on goal setting and action planning is also incredibly important. One research study showed that students who were bullied but who maintained a focus on their future possibilities were more resilient. There's a lot of goal-setting guidance for educators online. I really like a program called Future-Directed Therapy. This is actually an intervention for adults who are experiencing depression and anxiety, and it demonstrates clearly that if you engage those who are in emotional distress in planning for the future, it alleviates the distress and the anxiety. In goal setting, it's important that students set goals that are motivating because they're important and have value. Make sure that goals are specific, relevant, and attainable in a specific time. Putting the goals in writing and making sure that the goal is measurable so it's clear when it's been attained. After goal setting comes action planning. Students should engage in problem solving to identify the action steps necessary to achieve their goal, and then put those action steps in a sequence. They can then identify when each action step has been accomplished, evaluate the effectiveness of that action step, and revise their action plan as necessary. Young people, students should be engaged in goal setting and action planning every week. I know that educators have already heard a lot about growth mindset. You might have also seen some of the Education Week articles about concerns about the growth mindset. The growth mindset is exceptionally important, but I think what is necessary to have a growth mindset is the ability to engage in problem solving, to establish goals, and to develop an action plan. Therefore, it's essential to combine growth mindset with problem solving, as well as goal setting and action planning. When positively acknowledging students, it's important to note both their effort and their strategy. And if they haven't been successful, engage them in problem solving to identify alternative strategies. Note that effort in trying alternative strategies is the key to eventual success, And that's what it takes to have a growth mindset. The last essential component is engaged students. It is essential to ensure authentic student voice in assessment, planning, and evaluation of effectiveness of all school activities, and to engage students as leaders in an effort to foster positive relations. This includes using older students to educate and support younger students. Ensuring authentic student voice is essential to be able to shift from the authoritarian structure of schools to a much more engaged democratic structure. Students deserve to be heard and deserve to participate. This is also going to motivate students to take much greater responsibility. There are a number of excellent resources for schools in learning how to increase authentic student voice. The strategies include regularly soliciting student feedback, engaging students in studying and assessing their school, including authentic student representation and leadership teams, inviting students to any discussion related to their own learning, nothing about me without me, and consider young people as stakeholders and partners in their school. This is essential. As a natural companion to authentic student voice is engaging students in leadership roles to foster a positive school climate. Now, this can be a bit tricky because, as we learned in the first video, a lot of times the students who adults in the school perceive to be leaders are the ones who are actually being hurtful and exclusive of their peers. So it's really important to establish a process to identify kind, compassionate, inclusive students to serve in these leadership roles, but then also allow the student leadership group to grow, welcoming all students who are dedicated to these efforts. This includes also, hopefully, shifting the activities of the students who have been hurtful to achieve social dominance so that they then are also part of the group that is demonstrating kindness, compassion, and inclusivity. Next, we're going to discuss positive strategies for, not prevention, for fostering positive relations. We need to shift from trying to prevent the negative to trying to increase the positive. Strategies to foster positive relations include shifting from bullying prevention to fostering positive relations, fully engaging students as leaders, ensuring that all students gain effective skills, focusing on the positive norms held by the majority of students in your school, and helping students gain personal power. Fostering positive relations strategies also have incorporated the psychology of influence to motivate positive behavior, helping students learn to recognize rationalizations for being hurtful, reducing impulsive retaliation, increasing student resilience to increase their positive relations. It's important to increase student effectiveness in responding if they're being treated badly, influence students not to be hurtful, and to accept personal responsibility and accountability to remedy the harm if they were, and to increase positive peer interventions. So we're going to be discussing each of these elements. Hopefully this slide makes things perfectly clear. It is exceptionally important to shift from trying to prevent the negative to encouraging, embracing, focusing on fostering the positive. Okay, I know I'm repeating myself, but this is really important. If you want to have a positive school climate with students treating each other with kindness and respect, you've got to put your students in charge, identifying the kind, compassionate, and inclusive students, placing them in a leadership capacity with adults as guides by the side. You're not going to accomplish any positive change unless you follow this guidance. And of equal importance, ensuring that all students have the skills to effectively and independently handle hurtful incidents. This includes responding effectively if they're treated badly, stopping themselves and making things right if they are hurtful, and stepping in to help if they witness a hurtful incident. Remember what we talked about with the developmental considerations, especially as young people enter their teen years. They need the skills to independently handle these kinds of hurtful incidents. The positive social norms approach is exceptionally powerful. In accord with this theory, people misperceive the attitudes and behaviors of others, and this influences their own actions. When they learn about the actual positive norms of their peer group, they are much more willing to abide by those norms. This is an approach that's been used to reduce binge drinking at the college level. Currently, in society and in many schools, being hurtful, putting down those who are different, battling with rivals, is perceived to be an acceptable path to achieve social dominance. But the research shows that the majority of students do not like to see this occur, and the majority also admire those who are kind and respectful and who step in to help. There are a number of different ways to focus on positive social norms. Having all students participate in the development of a statement of shared values and personal commitments activity is one strategy. Establishing the student leadership team is another strategy, but a really powerful strategy is conducting a survey that asks about and identifies students' actual norms and then provide that data back to students in presentations and posters. A study was implemented to try this approach, specifically focusing on bullying. A social norm survey was administered to the students. It clarified the values of the majority of those students, and it clearly influenced those students to act in accord with those values. There was a significant reduction in bullying. I think it was 37% at one school, just by surveying the students and putting these posters up. In the Embrace Civility student survey that I conducted, I asked questions about the student norms. What's their normal reaction if they see a student being hurtful to another? 89% said that they don't really like to see this happen. Now, I don't really care whether this is actual reliable data. The importance of this data is not to actually accurately assess students' perceptions. The importance of this is to gather data that will then demonstrate to them what the majority of their peers say they think. But you don't just ask once, you have to ask in different ways. So this question asked, what kinds of people do you admire? Blue is admire, yellow mixed feelings, red don't admire. They admire those who are respectful and kind. Reach out to help. Tell somebody being hurtful to stop. Help someone who's hurtful stop and make things right. Were treated badly and responded in a positive way. Report serious concerns to an adult. And those who were hurtful but stopped and made things right. Note, we've got some real significant mixed feelings about retaliation. We'll talk about how to address that. Students don't like those who ignore hurtful situations, although some more mixed feelings on that. And they absolutely don't like those who laugh when seeing somebody being hurtful, create hurtful drama, or think it's cool to be disrespectful to others. And let's go at another way. What words would you use to describe someone who steps in to help? This was a fill in the blank, use your own words, and then you can create a word cloud based on how many times these words were used. This is a very effective strategy. Now, when you ask questions like this in a survey and then provide the data back to the students, especially if you have students providing the data to the students, what you have as a result is students sitting on the edges of their chair and being totally engaged because this is their data about what they think about how they treat each other. It's exceptionally powerful technique. We have to help students, especially those who are being frequently targeted, gain greater personal power. So here we're going over to the Harvard Graduate School of Business to talk to Amy Cuddy about presence. Her TED Talk, Power Posing, is the second most popular TED Talk in the world. When students present themselves with a powerful presence, this gives them feelings of more power and the ability to act in a confident manner, which changes how they are perceived. So you can fake it to make it. And I like using Disney's Let It Go from Frozen because I've taught power posing to 3-year-olds relying on that music video. The second component for personal power comes from the rational emotive theory thinking. We don't always have the ability to control what happens to us, but we do have the ability to control what we think about ourselves and how we respond. Also on the survey that I used, I asked students, what are the best ways to respond if somebody is hurtful? And the number one response was, think to myself, I choose not to give anybody the power to control how I feel about myself. This line of research also comes from the field of business. This is Cialdini's Psychology of Influence. There are 6 of the most effective strategies to influence behavior. Reciprocity, the golden rule. How would you feel if somebody did that to you? Making commitments and being consistent with those commitments. How does this fit with your personal commitment? That's why we ask students to make personal commitments. Social proof. This is the positive norms social theory that I've already talked about. What would others think? Liking. What would your friends think? We are more apt to do what people who we like would encourage us to do. Authority. What would your mom or dad think? We are more likely to act in accord with what those who are in a position of authority over us think we should do. And scarcity or possible loss. How would this damage your reputation, or how would this get you into trouble? It's also important to teach students about rationalizations. This is Bandura's mechanisms of moral disengagement. To hold those who have been hurtful accountable requires that they accept personal responsibility. But way too often, people create rationalizations to excuse wrongful behavior. Once you understand these rationalizations, you can pick them up quite frequently in news media and news stories. So here are the 4 most common ways to rationalize. Spin it. It was a joke. It was a prank. It was locker room talk. Boys will be boys. Deny personal responsibility. Someone else started it. Someone else should fix it. Deny the harm. She's overreacting. It wasn't that bad. Blame the other. He deserved it. Listen, you can hear these rationalizations almost on a daily basis in the news. So what we need to do is teach staff and students about how people rationalize wrongful behavior so that everybody starts to point out saying, hey, that's just an excuse. You are rationalizing. As I pointed out in part 1, impulsive retaliation appears to be a very significant concern. It is frequently a cause of hurtful behavior. it's modeled by society, and as I just showed you on the slides, students have mixed feelings about rationalization. There are some research-based strategies that we can use to address this concern. So to address the impulsive aspect, we focus on self-regulation, mindfulness, and de-escalation. It's also important, I believe, to increase the feelings of personal power. I choose not to give anyone the power to control how I feel about myself or act. There's one dynamite research study that showed that if you increase students' growth mindset, that is the recognition that others can change and the situation can change, this reduces the impulse to engage in retaliation. Also, problem-solving skills. If something has happened, we need to know how to think things through to decide what is the best thing to do. So now that I've shown you all the ingredients, we're going to put them together in a recipe format to address specific issues. How can we increase resilience, especially the resilience of students who are more frequently targeted? We help them maintain a powerful physical presence, build their individual strengths, focus on their future and engage in goal setting, express gratitude for the things that are great in their lives, and engage in acts of kindness to others. The recipe for increasing students' effectiveness in responding in situations where they've been treated badly is that they need to know how to de-escalate immediately to remain calm, stand tall to show presence, use rational emotive thinking to retain their personal power, engage in problem solving to figure out how to respond, connect with an adult or a friend, and reach out to be kind to somebody else to change how they are feeling. So the ingredients for the recipe to try to influence hurtful students not to be hurtful and to accept personal responsibility and remedy the harm if they were includes these ingredients. Increase their understanding of positive social norms, that their peers don't like to see them be hurtful but do admire if they recognize they made a mistake, stopped themselves, and made things better. Use all of the principles from the psychology of influence. How would you feel? What commitments have you made? What do others think? What do your friends think? What would your mom or dad think? These are all powerful. Help them understand and recognize when they are making rationalizations. Teach them the 4 steps to reduce the likelihood that they'll engage in impulsive retaliation. And take steps to hold them accountable and help them to engage in problem solving on how to remedy the harm. We're going to talk about how to hold them accountable later in this video. So there's an hour-long keynote address that I made on how to increase positive peer intervention. So this is a really reduced version. There appear to be personal factors involved. We need to help increase students' motivation by encouraging them to feel responsible for others and encouraging inclusion. There are issues related to personal power. Those who have greater personal power feel less risk to stepping in. So we have to encourage those who have the power to step in, but also teach safer private strategies for those who might have less personal power. And we have to increase their self-efficacy by teaching effective skills in stepping in to help. Positive peer intervention is also heavily influenced by social environmental factors. Friendships is a key factor. Friends tend to help friends. So the most important thing we need to do is focusing on encouraging students to help their friends who have been hurtful do the right thing in stopping and making things right. We have to ensure an overall positive school climate of kindness, inclusion, and shared responsibility. And again, we'll come back to this. Focus strongly on the positive social norms of admiration for those who step in to help. And lastly, we have to address the barriers that occur as well as the rationalizations they may make. The key barriers to stepping in to help are that they fear failure, embarrassment, or retaliation. So if we can increase their self-efficacy in skills of knowing how to step in to help, especially focusing on private strategies, we can reduce these barriers. The most common rationalization for not stepping in to help are that someone else should do it or they should mind their own business. So we have to help them understand how these kinds of rationalizations can interfere with their positive behavior of stepping in to help. Okay, now here's a brief advertising break. If you're wondering how in the world is my school going to accomplish all of this, you might want to look on my website for a program called Embrace Civility, where the focus is on teaching students skills in 5 areas: how they can reach out to say stop, report concerns, stop, own it, and fix it, and be positively powerful. I'm going to show you some slides from this program. These are the lessons from Embrace Civility. Be positively powerful. This is the last lesson on the slide. If someone's hurtful, I will stand tall, respond in a positively powerful way. I will focus on the good and make a positive difference. So you can see the first step is how can you effectively respond, and the second step is how can you become more resilient and have better peer relations. You will see how I've translated the research into positive statements for students. I am positively powerful. I stay calm. I keep my personal power. I stand tall. I respond effectively. I use my strengths. I think things through. I build my future. I focus on the good, and I make a positive difference. Stop, own it, and fix it. I always remember that my choices show who I truly am. I will stop myself and make things right if I have been hurtful. My choice. When I see someone being hurtful, I can be a hurtful participant, passive observer, or a helpful ally. I can be a helpful ally by reaching out, saying stop, and reporting concerns. To reach out, I can reach out to be kind to those who are treated badly or left out. I can also help others think things through or help them resolve conflict. If it's safe, and we do have to focus on safety, I will publicly tell someone being hurtful to stop. I will also help someone who was hurtful stop, own it, and fix it. This is specifically focused on trying to influence friends of those who are hurtful to stop their friends. If it's a serious situation, I will tell an adult who can help. Lastly, we're going to discuss positive strategies for intervention. Now, as you're listening to this and you're trying to think, now how the heck am I going to remember all of this and translate it into action at school? Never fear. I'm writing up extensive guidance on how to effectively implement these strategies for intervention, both at the staff level as well as intervention by the principal or counselor in a more chronic or serious situation. And those resources are available on my website. We need to address interventions in a two-part thinking. We have to increase the effectiveness of staff response immediately when the hurtful incidents occur. And then we need to ensure effective remediation and resolution after a hurtful incident or a more serious, significant hurtful situation. For the immediate intervention situations, we must ensure that all staff have training in effective de-escalation skills. And the need for this goes beyond dealing with student-on-student hurtful behavior. When a student is triggering and acting in non-compliance to the teacher, that teacher also has to have these de-escalation skills. This is a critical component that's been left out of efforts to reduce suspensions. It's also important to establish a calming place in classrooms at the elementary level or that students can go to at the secondary level. The absolute best and most effective guidance that schools have received has come from the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. If a hostile environment exists, schools are required to take steps that are reasonably calculated to end the harassment by the hurtful students, remedy the harmful effects on the target, and correct any aspects of the environment that appear to be supporting the hurtful acts. This is the framework for effective intervention. Translating the civil rights guidance to a plan of action for school means that we need to identify the challenges of any involved students and put a positive action plan in place to address those challenges. It may be necessary to implement protections for the target. And through an accountability process, the hurtful student as well as that student's supporters need to be brought to a position where they accept personal responsibility and take steps to remedy the harm both to the target and to the school community. It's also necessary to investigate and ensure that corrections are made to the environment to address any identified concerns. This may include corrections of staff behavior, as well as actions deemed helpful to improve inclusion. Because we know that frequently adult interventions are not effective, do not make things better, or might make things worse, it's essential to have ongoing monitoring to ensure that things get better for all involved students. I'm also introducing and suggest that you consider the implementation of a peer assistance and accountability team. A big, strong supporter of multiple tier system of supports. It's an excellent approach to address concerns of student at greater risk. I think we can expand our thinking of multiple tier system of supports to address the hurtful incidents and situations. So here's how to think about this. Students and staff need to have the skills to effectively resolve minor hurtful incidents, so these are kind of in the green zone, and the principals and the others supporting them, counselors, need to engage in an effective investigation and intervention in the more serious or chronic situations. So at the Tier 1 level, these are the more minor hurtful incidents that students can resolve by themselves or with staff help. So we have to focus on empowering students and staff with skills. At the Tier 3 level, yes, I skipped something, I'll get to it. At the Tier 3 level are the very serious and chronic situations that are involving students who are at much greater risk. These situations will require intensive intervention. Frequently, these are situations that involve students with disabilities, and we'll talk about that. So here's where the slight switch comes when we're thinking about the multiple tier system of supports for hurtful incidents. Tier 2 level should be considered the more serious or chronic situations that require resolution by the principal. That is, this is more serious than a teacher or a teacher's aide could handle. These situations require a more comprehensive investigation, supportive and restorative interventions, may require correction of a hostile environment and absolutely requires monitoring. Where this differs from the traditional thinking of multiple tier system of supports is that the involved students may or may not otherwise be considered at a tier 2 level of risk. You may have a very socially skilled, effective student who needs to be considered at a tier 2 level because he or she is being hurtful to others. The multiple tier system of supports thinking can also be applied to the situations where it is necessary to intervene with staff. At a tier 1 level, it's important to empower staff with the skills to effectively intervene in hurtful incidents. At a tier 2 level, it may be necessary to provide instruction and supportive interventions if a staff member has been hurtful or has not responded effectively. And at a tier 3 level, we're at a level of staff disciplinary process for serious situations where they are being consistently hurtful or not effectively responding to hurtful situations. It is essential to maintain an empowerment perspective when working with any student who has been treated badly. That student has had power taken from them by somebody else. Adults should not continue to take their power by assuming control over how the situation will be handled. It is essential to fully engage the targeted student in the development of a plan of action to address this situation. It is necessary to increase the effectiveness of staff when they witness a hurtful situation. They need to know how to effectively and rapidly resolve the minor incidents, as well as to identify the more serious or chronic situations for referral for a more comprehensive intervention. It's important that they have the skills to de-escalate the incident and ensure student safety. Then it's necessary for them to conduct an initial private investigation to determine if this is minor or more serious. If it's a minor incident, they may be able to handle it, or if it's a more serious incident, they should report this to the office. It's important that staff understand that what they witness is very likely not the whole picture. They may witness an incident that is one of a repeated series of incidents, or they may witness what is retaliation. That is, the student who appears to be being hurtful is the one who's been treated badly extensively over a long period of time. This is why this initial private investigation is so important. Now, this looks a little complicated. As I said, there are resources available for schools that provide much more insight for all school staff on how to respond to these minor incidents. If it's a conflict, they need to engage in conflict resolution. If there's an imbalance of power between the students, they may need to use shuttle diplomacy. They should ask the targeted student what would help to resolve the issue. Remember, we want to empower these students. Ask accountability questions of the hurtful students to get them to the point where they will accept personal responsibility and agree to take steps to remedy the harm. It is also important to ask accountability questions of any students who were deemed to be supporters of the student who was being hurtful, so that they too will remedy the harm. And it's important to engage in follow-up to ensure that things got better. So in any serious or chronic situation, it will be necessary to develop a positive action plan to address the challenges of any of the participants to increase their resiliency. It also may be necessary to provide for protections for a targeted student. It's necessary to hold any student who is hurtful accountable And if this is a bidirectional hurtful situation, then all of the students who were hurtful need to be held accountable. It is also necessary to hold the supporters accountable, as well as to correct any aspects of the environment that may be supporting the hurtful actions, and address the more significant concerns of students with disabilities within the context of an IEP or 504 plan, and ensure evaluation to ensure effectiveness. The positive action plan is designed for any students with challenges. This is a plan to increase their resilience, and this may be the student who's engaging in hurtful behavior. This student needs connections with a staff ally, needs increased friendships and the opportunities for positive peer interactions, increased engagement with a focus on their strengths, future directions, goal setting, and possibly volunteering, increase in their empowerment with a focus on mindfulness, problem solving, and presence, and an increase in their happiness by focusing on gratitude. The reality is, while I'm suggesting this as a positive action plan for any student with challenges, the framework for this positive action plan could be a framework for all of the students in your school. We have to connect the dots. Chronic bullying is a form of trauma. Students who have experienced chronic bullying, and that includes those who have experienced bullying or other trauma and are now being hurtful, have experienced trauma. So a trauma-informed care approach is necessary to remedy the harm. As part of the development of this positive action plan, it's important to recognize that this student has challenges in social relationships. So therefore, engage this student in a discussion about his or her perspectives of these challenges, then in problem solving of strategies he or she could use to address these challenges that make use of his or her strengths, and support that he or she desires to accomplish these objectives. Note that the importance of this thinking is that the student who has challenges is offered the opportunity within an environment for that student to take leadership and control over addressing those challenges. It's important to identify and establish a relationship with a staff ally who will engage in consistent positive check-in, asking, who did you have a great connection with today? How did you reach out to be kind? What did you do that you're proud of, that used one of your strengths? What goal did you achieve? Were there any issues that came up that required you to remain calm and think things through? What happened today that you are thankful for? Think about the difference in this kind of a positive check-in as compared to one checking in to ensure that the student was compliant. It may be necessary to also implement a protections plan for the targeted student. The check-in plan with the staff ally, increased staff supervision, safe passages in areas where the student has been more significantly targeted, a place of refuge or calming if necessary, helping that student gain strategies to respond when somebody is hurtful, possibly a no-contact order for the student who was hurtful, and other strategies identified by the targeted student as possibly being helpful for him or her. Now, the intervention with the student who has been hurtful and that student's supporters is going to in part be built upon the concepts of restorative practices. Restorative practices seek to hold those who are hurtful accountable to remedy the harm to anybody harmed as well as the community. The research basis for this approach is excellent, but it is really important not to use the recommended strategies of circles to address individual concerns, or what schools have adapted the conferences approach to mediation when there's an imbalance of power. So we're going to use the thinking of obtaining the restorative response, but not the current recommended strategies. The second component of this accountability approach is to incorporate the collaborative problem-solving process. Collaborative problem-solving is a structured process for students who have engaged in wrongdoing. Part of this process identifies the challenges of those students, so that's what we've already talked about. But then, as part of the resolution, the approach encourages the staff member to collaborate with the student in problem solving to identify strategies to address those challenges. Now, in addition to using this process for those students who were hurtful, it is absolutely imperative to also address their supporters. Friends of those who are hurtful most often support their hurtful friends. And support for hurtful friends is really significantly implicated in the challenge of mobbing. So friends of those who are hurtful are also in the best position to support avoidance of future harm. So my recommendation is an accountability process that merges the insight from restorative practices and collaborative problem solving along with the psychology of influence, combined in a structured, individualized process to use for both hurtful students as well as their supporters. And this process is aimed at helping them understand their motivations as well as rationalizations, reflect on how others think about such actions, the positive norms approach, acknowledge the harm that was caused, and accept personal responsibility for their actions. Now, after the student has accepted personal responsibility for his or her actions, engage the student in problem solving of strategies that he or she will use to remedy the harm to the one who is treated badly, as well as to the school community. It may be best to give the student an evening to think things through, to come up with some strategies. I also recommend adding a remedy to the community that requires a student to engage in a number, say 3, acts of kindness to another student every day for, say 20 days, with a report back on how they were kind and their perspectives on what happened when they engaged in these kind activities. What we're trying to do is shift them away from being hurtful to get attention or get dominance to acts of kindness and how it feels when they are kind and the response of the students to whom they are kind. At the end of the accountability process comes the accountability agreement, which contains an acknowledgement of wrongdoing and the harmful impact, the remedy of harm to the student who is harmed, the remedy of harm to the school community, an agreement to abide by any requirements of the protection plan, and to avoid further hurtful acts. This agreement is then to be signed by the student and his or her parents or guardians, and this can be considered that there is a disciplinary consequence held in abeyance as if the student violates this agreement. If you're dealing with a bidirectional hurtful situation, it's necessary to conduct an accountability process and complete an accountability agreement with all of the parties. And either or both may require a positive action plan or a protection plan. For resolution, you may need to engage in shuttle diplomacy, or if there isn't an imbalance of power, you may be able to address this through mediation. But all students need to be held accountable for the hurtful behavior that they have engaged in. The next very important step is to identify any aspects of the environment that may be supporting hurtful actions of students. Are there any staff who are being hurtful, or did any staff fail to effectively intervene? Does any aspect of the school's behavior management plan model shaming and exclusion of students? Are there concerns regarding cultural competence of staff and students and acceptance of diversity? Are there any concerns related to athletics or extracurricular groups? All of these issues need to be considered, and an action plan needs to be developed to address any identified concerns. Correcting aspects of the environment may require clear expectations and directives for staff, as well as professional development. Necessary modifications to the behavior management plan to ensure that it promotes inclusion. Strategies to increase cultural competence of staff and students and greater inclusion. Authentic student voice, and an evaluation plan. As was noted in Part 1, the federal government issued 2 Dear Colleague letters which indicated that if a student with disabilities is being bullied or engaging in bullying, this needs to be addressed in an IEP or 504 meeting. Frequently, the students with disabilities who are engaging in bullying are also being bullied. So first, it's necessary to focus on functional skills. It is quite probable that a student with disabilities who's having interpersonal relationship challenges needs better functional skills, objectives, and an instructional plan, and an evaluation of that instruction. This should be incorporated into the student's IEP, and as well as the positive action plan should be incorporated into the IEP. To develop these functional skills, it is absolutely necessary to revise or rethink or think beyond the current FBA approach of looking at antecedents, behavior, and consequences. This ABC thinking is grounded in 1950s behavior theory that hasn't been updated to reflect insight into trauma-informed care. Rely on collaborative problem solving with the student in an analysis of his or her challenges in combination with his or her own problem solving ideas on how to better address those challenges. This plan also should incorporate the student's strengths. In addition, it is necessary to address a lot of these issues related to the situation within the section of the IEP that addresses supplemental aids and services. The protection plan can be incorporated here. Identify any necessary staff directives and the professional development needs of those staff. Identify the strategies that the school is going to undertake to improve the environment, to increase inclusion of this student and other students with disabilities. And assess and revise the school's overall behavior management plan to ensure that it is not shaming and excluding these students with greater challenges. So we saw the data on the effectiveness of school response in these situations and know how challenging that is. Ongoing monitoring is absolutely essential to ensure that things get better for all of the involved students. Have a staff ally monitoring any student who's on a positive action plan. The principal should monitor the protection plan as well as the accountability agreement with the hurtful student as well as any supporters. Lastly, and rather creatively, if I do say so myself, I suggest considering the implementation of a peer assistance and accountability team. This idea is a merger of the concepts of peer mediation and teen court, both of which are effective strategies. This could be a group within the student leadership team, but this group will require additional instruction. The primary purpose for a PAT is to facilitate the accountability process and agreement with the student who was hurtful and his or her supporters. These students could also engage in additional peer support and peer mediation activities within the school community. My recommendation is that the PAT accountability team, that is the team that is meeting with the student who was hurtful and his or her supporters, include 3 students. One student who is of higher social status within the school, one who is within the class of students who are more frequently treated badly, and one student who in the past was hurtful and has gone through this accountability process in a successful manner. The advantages of using a PAT include that this is an really effective way to communicate the positive social norms of students, and students will communicate this far better than the principal or school staff. The fact that peers have been involved may increase the perspective that a violation of the accountability agreement will be detected and reported. And this also communicates to the student who was hurtful and his or her supporters that remedying the harm leads to continued acceptance in the community. I do hope that the time we've spent together has been helpful for you. There is more information on my website as well as additional resources. Thanks very much for your attention.